This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firminish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Life Worlds. Where to even begin a conversation about the universe? To evoke the life worlds of the cosmos is to brush up against the most profound questions that lie at the heart of our humanity. Who are we? What are we? What is life? Are we alone out here? And really, what the hell is this vast, resplendent, dynamic field that we exist within and are constituted by on our most cellular level? When we speak of the universe, I find it's practically impossible to avoid speaking about theology and religion, mathematics and philosophy, and as we'll see today, even sentience and intelligence. A small jump to the punchline, and then I'll backtrack. In this episode, we're going to cover everything from what's out there in space and the stunning variety of exoplanets we're only beginning to map. We'll cover what life is, what is information, what is meaning, and how do we begin to draw boundaries on what we're even searching for in space, the planet's technosphere, and how interplanetary discoveries and the aspirations to settle the solar system may inform new myths and narratives on Earth. And finally, science as sacred, as a gateway to awe. Because cosmology and astrobiology embed our individual stories in something vastly large. The history of humanity's relationship to space is fundamentally one of myth and philosophy. Let's remember where our original cosmology began. Our ancestors, the hunting, gathering Paleolithic peoples, tracked under vast skies the annual cycles of the sun, the moon, the stars, using the spinning sphere of the sky's pinprick lights to predict their harvests and guide their hunts, to orient their vessels across vast oceans. The stars were worshipped as gods, and the cosmos itself as a divine living being. And then around 600 to 400 BC, something radical happened. The Greeks, building on Babylonian records, started asking not who, but what is moving the stars. Some say this was the birth of natural philosophy, our first attempt to explain the cosmos through reason, to transform the whims of gods into a predictable mathematical universe. And then, a few centuries later, we got Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton. By the 17th century, the cosmos had become clockwork, a universe of masses obeying laws. This is where religion is inseparable from science. As a quick side note, let's not forget that the first major timekeepers were the monastic routines of thousands of Benedictine monasteries. And so, because of the switch to monotheism being the belief that there is only one ultimate God, versus the traditional pantheon of gods and spirits, monotheism really marks the moment when Western civilization rejected the cosmos as a divine being. Instead, it became the product of a separate creator. As Jo Marchant writes in her remarkable book, The Human Cosmos, now God could look down at the stars instead of being in the stars. Fast forwarding through several other revolutions, the 20th century saw yet more upheavals in humanity's relationship with space. with the likes of Einstein, Hubble, and the advent of quantum physics. Things got weird, entangled, nonlinear. The observer suddenly got pulled back into the picture. The concept of inside and outside became blurred. And this brings us onto today's topic, astrobiology. Today, astrobiology is genuinely interdisciplinary. It sits at the intersection of astronomy, biology, chemistry, geology, even philosophy. And it inquires into the origins of life, how chemistry became biology, what makes a planet habitable, could we even recognize life from a distance, and by what signatures in alien atmospheres could we betray the presence of something alive? Some background to astrobiology is found in exobiology, its precursor. In 1961, Frank Drake scrolled the now famous Drake equation onto a blackboard at the first scientific meeting on SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And this was a formula that tried to estimate the number of communicable civilizations in our galaxy at any given time. The search for life outside of the Earth was further amplified by the discovery of radical life forms on Earth, such as in the 1970s when hydrothermal vents were discovered on the ocean floor, teeming with life and shattering the assumption that life required the sun. Or when we discovered extremophile bacteria living in inhospitable places like boiling acid, the Antarctic ice, and hyper-salty lakes. And it was only in 1995 that the first exoplanet was confirmed around a sun-like star. And we can now estimate there might be over 10 billion trillion experiments where life could have happened on these planets in space. So, our guest today is Adam Frank. Adam Frank is an American physicist, astronomer, and writer. He's a leading expert on the final stages of evolution for stars like the Sun, and as professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester, his computational research group has developed advanced supercomputer tools for studying how stars form and how they die. His work includes studies of exoplanet atmospheres in astrobiology, and the latter includes studies of the generic responsive planets, the evolution of energy-intensive civilizations. He is one of the most prominent science communicators out there and has authored 5 books, several of which we will be speaking about today. A thrilling question that Adam has posed is that of, if life exists elsewhere, and the numbers suggest it probably could, what becomes of a technological civilization given enough time, let's say thousands or millions of years? What kinds of social forms might it have? How would it achieve balance? And this matters because this is where astrobiology meets climate science and the current climate crisis. Adam describes how our technosphere is immature. Our current civilization on Earth is debasing the very substrate it needs to survive. I was stunned when in 2020 I read that the total material weight of the technosphere, which is measured by the mass of all human-made materials, so think buildings, infrastructure, roads, plastics, the total weight of the technosphere has surpassed the total mass of all living organisms on Earth. Okay, that's pretty crazy. So we have to wonder, as Adam says, does all of intelligent life in space go through this learning crunch? And if so, astrobiology isn't just about finding life out there. It might be our most useful mirror for understanding what we're doing down here. I want to end this introduction with the question that has stayed with me since I began researching these topics and reading thinkers like the mathematician Max Tegmark, who describes the universe as a mathematical structure. Fascinating book, by the way, I'll put in the show notes. Or the biophysicist Sarah Walker, whose assembly theory is building statistical frameworks for life detection. Eventually, all roads lead back to the same question: what really is life? The way I have come to see it, maybe there's 2 paths. Either 1, life is fundamental. It is always present and complexity just elaborates on it. Or 2, it's an emergent property, and at some point, life is breathed into matter, per se, arising from an arrangement of things that didn't have it before. And that then begs the question, well, at what point does an arrangement of atoms become something categorically different? For example, water is wet, but neither hydrogen nor oxygen is wet. Wetness as a quality emerges from their combination. Personally, and of course, I have no real clue, I wonder if it's not the first path, if life might indeed be inherent, a fundamental and latent feature of reality from the very beginning. The way that I wonder about it, if the atoms that constitute my body eventually become a living organism, me, then surely the potential for life is latent within the atoms, and that means that it somehow already is life. It makes me think of the quote by Michelangelo where he says, "I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free." Maybe we carve into life until it's set free. I've learned that this approach resonates with the likes of the philosopher Spinoza, who believed there was one substance in the universe, and what we call mind and matter are just two different attributes of that one thing. Alfred Whitehead also argued that experience in some primitive form goes all the way down. And in many indigenous and Eastern belief systems like Taoism, there's no ontological gap between living and non-living because everything is the Tao in motion. Now, others like Sarah Walker, whose work I find deeply fascinating, might disagree with this and say that life itself is what emerges when that potential is actualized through complexity and information, and that we can quantify a threshold for life. Perhaps this tension can never be resolved, and this is what we call the hard problem of consciousness. That means that you can, in principle, give a complete account of everything a brain does, neurons, signals, etc., and still not have answered why there is something like what it is to be that brain. Our guest today, Adam Frank, writes extensively about this in his latest book, The Blind Spot, where he argues that modern science has an unexamined blind spot built into its foundations, which is the assumption that you can create a complete account of reality that leaves out an experiencer. And in that book, he explores how experience and the world are entangled. Life and mind and world are co-constituted. And perhaps that is why we should be more interested in sentience than intelligence. The sense of there is something to be alive, down to the microbe. And this is very life worldsy, as you can imagine. And another way that philosophy relates to astrobiology. Life out there cannot be separated from the question of what is life, which cannot be separated from what is experience. So, with that preamble, and each of these things could possibly warrant an entire episode, I'm going to hand over to our conversation with Adam Frank. Adam, hello and welcome to Life Worlds. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I must admit that before coming across your work, I was reading astrophysicists and mathematicians and immersing myself in your extended field, but the term astrobiology was newer to me. And in the introduction, I've sort of queued that up for the listeners. What I think has been so, I'd say, sort of aperture opening for me in terms of astrobiology is the very profound questions that it brings up about what it means to be human, what we're ensconced within in the universe, so on and so forth. And perhaps starting off today's conversation with maybe what one of the most profound questions is, which is the question of just what is life? And you have spoken about that really, really through a lot of very interesting lenses that I hadn't come across before. And obviously as an astrobiologist, you're looking for life amongst the stars. And maybe before getting to that more philosophical aspect of what life is and all of its practicalities, maybe you could bring the listeners and just bring us into what is it even like out there in some of the places where life could be, like in these potential habitable zones or Goldilocks zones, these new classes of planets? What are the conditions in some of the places you've been seeing?
Yeah, that's the joy of this field. And of course, on some level, we don't yet know because we have not gotten yet the telescopic acuity to be able to actually see surfaces, right? So we have discovered thousands and thousands of planets orbiting other stars. But we don't yet have the technology to directly see their surfaces. So what we're doing is we're inferring from things like their density whether or not they are a rocky planet or, say, a gaseous planet. But from that's actually, we couldn't do this 30 years ago. When I started as a graduate student, we didn't know whether there were any planets in the universe other than the ones orbiting the sun. So what has been remarkable is that we have been able to get a handle on things like there's a lot of planets of Earth size or even smaller. So that's one thing, right? These are going to be rocky worlds. They likely, hopefully, we'll see, have atmospheres. And if they have atmospheres, then we should expect, based on everything that we've seen on Earth, and then we have Venus and Mars, which also have atmospheres, that there should be things like rain falling, right? If you've got an atmosphere, then you have what are called volatiles. These are things that melt and freeze, within a reasonable range of temperatures. So you can expect to have mountains, because we know Mars has mountains. We know Venus has mountains. And we can expect to have things like snow falling on those mountains. And we can expect to have rain. And we can expect to have some worlds that are ocean worlds, where the entire planet is basically, underwater. We have found evidence now for an entirely new class of ocean world, a world that would be, maybe like 5 or 6 times the size of Earth, and have maybe 8 times its mass, and would have an ocean so deep that it may extend down 700 miles. The deepest part of Earth's ocean are only 6 miles. So what we found is that there's this incredible variety of planets out there. And this opens up a wide range of possibilities for how and where life might form.
That, I think you recently published a piece where you spoke about that world that would just be the oceans. And it's just so evocative. I think as humans, having, fundamentally emerged from oceans as so many life forms have, there's something so primal that it evokes in our imagination, just the fact that there could be these worlds with these oceans and what's underneath. And then something else I've heard you speak of are worlds where you could have just permanent night or permanent day and some things, or the relationship to light. And then that makes me think, well, how would that affect, potential forms of life on those planets if they're perpetually in the light or perpetually in the shade?
Right. Right. So that's what those are what are called tidally locked worlds. So the moon is tidally locked to the Earth. And what that means is, as the moon goes around the Earth, right, when it completes one orbital revolution, that takes about a month. It turns out that the spin of the moon is also about a month. So the moon is spinning on its axis, just like the Earth spins on its axis, right? That's what gives us the day-night cycle. But the moon, because of the gravitational interaction between the moon and the Earth, has had its spin rate slowed down by the Earth's gravity until the spin, the time it takes to revolve around its axis and the time it takes to rotate around its orbit are the same. So that's what's called tidally locked. And that's why we always see the same face of the moon. You never get to see the other side of the moon, right? So there are planets. If a planet is orbiting close enough to its star, then the same process of tidal locking can occur, where one side of the planet is always facing directly towards the star, and the other side is always in perpetual night. So what that would mean, these would be amazing worlds, because the sun would just hang in the sky forever. It would be noon forever, right? On the day side of the planet. And on the night side, it would be perpetual darkness. And, could you even get life on a planet like that? Would life have to only exist kind of in what we call the terminator, the region, the day-night, the twilight region, right? That region just at the edge of daylight and sunlight. So, what this really demonstrates is how much this field of astrobiology and the field of exoplanet studies, right? So any planet that's not orbiting the sun, we call an exoplanet. The variety, the stunning variety of circumstances, of stories, right, that all of these exoplanets provide for life. And what's so exciting is that we're just beginning. Like we discovered our first exoplanet in 1995. We now know that every star in the sky has an exoplanet. And so now we're just developing the telescope technologies to actually probe those planets. Right now it's in indirect ways, but still, we can learn things about the atmospheres of the planets, what's in the atmospheres. So it's very exciting because literally we're just beginning, and we're being forced to push our imaginations to places where they haven't gone before.
What you're describing, it makes me think it's akin to, I think it was in the 16th centuries or so that when we first really started working with glass, and that was the first time that we could have microscopes and telescopes. And that opened up a whole aperture of the microbial world, and even just looking at the stars and the more fundamental, and all of the seismic shifts that created across human consciousness, because you become sort of situated within like such vast different scales of life. And I think what you're describing, I mean, it's astounding that, in our lifetimes, like 1995, we're just on the tip or the brink of what you're describing. And a little bit later, I'm really excited to ask you about what that does to our mythology, our consciousness, especially at a moment in time when, I think many, many people are feeling, justly so, the sort of claustrophobia, I think, of a lot of the current events and trying to figure out who we are and what we are. If we go to the elements of life, and we've had many people on the podcast like Carl Safina and Paco Calvo, and speaking about intelligence amongst other forms of life. I think that one of the funniest things about humans is we look for self-similarity. It's like, oh, well, crows can do these tasks, therefore they must be super smart. And of course, corvids are brilliant, but there's so many things that other animals can do that we can't. And so this attribution of intelligence to self-similar things is interesting. And I know you've obviously written about this in terms of life in space. But even since I was a child, I've always thought but life could be like a gas, or life could express itself in so many different ways because it's bound by maybe different laws of physics. And so as someone who's looking for life out there, in there, what are you how do you think about life, and what are you looking for? Because it's not going to be humanoid, probably.
Oh, absolutely not. It's not going to be. I mean, this is the funny thing about UFOs, right? There's this thing with the grays, or the little green men. And when you look at the process of evolution, which we have reasons to think is universal, that the process of evolution is really a logic, not something that's tied to specific, forms of chemistry, carbon-based chemistry, or, using water as a solute. That evolution is really just kind of a logic of competition, or, and what you find is that accidents matter as much as physics matter, and physics and chemistry matter. So the odds that you're going to get something that looks like us is pretty astronomically small. So that's what's always funny to me, that everyone's like, oh, look, the UFO guys look exactly like us, except they're a little short, they're kind of cute or malevolent or whatever. So, okay, but this question, you're raising a really interesting question, which is how to go beyond life as we know it. How do we talk about life as we don't know it? And this is something that Sarah Walker, who is also an astrobiologist, theoretical physicist like myself, has done a lot of really interesting thinking about. Now, the thing is, we think the laws of physics are common, that sort of everywhere in the universe you get the same laws of physics. But I do think that there's something about what makes life unique as a physical system compared to rocks or volcanoes or comets is its organization. It's the way life is, the relationship between all of its processes. It's kind of a very abstract thing. It's not just chemistry. It's not just like, oh, it uses carbon chemistry, it doesn't use silicon chemistry. It's really what may be universal is that life, and this is the real mystery, I think, about it. Life requires a kind of self-organization. Life is this process that is able to refer back to itself. And that is what we should be looking for. We're not looking for carbon-based, things with 3 legs or 5 legs. We're looking for a kind of system that has self-organized itself such that it is able to sort of parse meaning out of its environments. And so there's ways to maybe look for that in things like the structure of the chemical networks. Like if you're looking from a distance, that maybe you could look at a distant planet, look at all the chemicals that it's in its atmosphere, figure out which chemicals are reacting with which other chemicals, and say like, oh, you know what? geology is never going to do that. That the network, what we call the network structure or the network topology of you have a chemical reaction network that must have been put together by biology. Doesn't have to be carbon-based biology, but it is indicative of this process of life as a self-organizing, self-referential, autonomous agent. All these other words I'm going to start using that to me are, we have a large project right now where we're really interested in what I might call the physics of agency, right? Because that's what's really weird about life. Life from microbes all the way up. That's why I don't, this question about intelligence, like clearly human beings have a particular kind of intelligence. We're self-conscious, there's a certain kind of reasoning that we do, but I actually am more interested in sentience than I am in intelligence, because I think every microbe has, sort of a fundamental quality of sentience. And without sentience, there's no intelligence. So the real mystery is sentience. And sentience is about being an agent, being an autonomous, self-directed, self-creating, self-maintaining agent. And that's the real mystery. And I think anything we find anywhere in the universe, if we're going to call it life, is going to be that.
So would you say in your sort of ontology of sentience is some being agent that expresses intelligence? So the intelligence comes after there's a sentience, and the sentience is the self-referential there's something about its agency and in what creates for you a sentient entity.
Yeah, as there was the philosopher Charles Nagel who wrote this famous paper back in the 70s of what is it like to be a bat. And what was great, what I love about philosophy is like the coining of that word. What is it like to be what is it like to, that's what defines life. There's something that it's like to be alive, right? Mm-hmm. And so what that really defined, what he did there was he was able to sort of point to this quality of interiority. I'm not even going to be able. I'm from Jersey. I can't pronounce that. It's the interiority, and that is why my new phrase that I'm using wherever I go is life is different, right? We can't think what life is clearly. It's a physical system, but we can't think of life, solely as a robot. We can't think, if we robotize or machinize life, then we're going to kill the thing that we're most interested in. And so I believe that there are principled, meaning, scientifically valid, experimentally viable ways of exploring these aspects of life, but that don't turn into a reductionist, materialist kind of, robotronic cell view, right? That, life is just a machine. It's just a biochemical machine. I think that really misses fundamentally the really strangeness of what it means for something to be alive. So that's for me, at least, and I think I might be a little heretical in that, but that is the real frontier for understanding a kind of a science of life. And what's amazing to me, we talked about, this book that I and my colleagues wrote called The Blind Spot, where we were trying to articulate this view. And we expected that book to be that we were going to be heretics in writing this book, because we were really challenging kind of the standard sort of, scientistic view of reductionist view of the world. And instead, actually, the book got great reviews. We've had really strong response to it. And as I like to say, you can't be a heretic if nobody wants to set you on fire. So I've been sort of surprised by the positive response to that book. It shows that I think across the sciences, there's a real willingness now to sort of start asking these kinds of questions in different ways. Again, still scientifically principled ways, but without that kind of default to what we call the blind spot philosophies of, naive realism, mechanistic. Well, mechanisms are fine, but you don't want to totalize with your mechanistic views. Like, definitely you want to look at parts of what cells do as mechanisms, but the cell itself, the mystery of the cell itself is this self-organizing character.
Yeah. What I really also appreciated in that book is you didn't, some other writers have also begun to conflate, and you rightly tread that line between let's not go all the way that way, quantum mechanics with Eastern faiths. And I think there's there's a delicate line between the hyper materialistic reductionist worldview that we're moving away from, and then the whole sort of post-truth and full emergence.
Oh,
And I think it's a tricky world to be in to navigate that. I think one of the writers that really influenced me in this kind of space that you're describing is, Gregory Bateson, and all of these concepts of sort of extended cognition. And my favorite metaphor when I think about it is like, you have a spider in a spider web, and where is the mind in that? Is it the spider? But obviously the leg is its extended liquid in this case, sort of silk brain, if you will. And so when you were sharing before about life, and these sorts of physics of agency, and the question that it brings up for me, especially when we're talking about the cosmos, is like, on what scale? Because when I, with my limited perspective, look at space and the world, and even when we look at like the Earth, and we'll talk about Gaia theory, or Gaia, not theory, kind of it's
the Gaia hypothesis. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Hypothesis. I think it's kind of beyond that at this stage, maybe. But if we look at life, on what scale? Because the whole universe is self-organizing potentially, right? The whole universe is doing what it's doing, and things are, fractal. I'm trying to stay away from the new age word, but things are fractal, and they do sort of repeat across scales. And so the universe itself has self-organization at that level. So life would therefore be inherent according to this definition that you're giving.
Well, I don't, so this is something I would work. I wouldn't say that the universe itself, I would put it a different way. I don't think that the universe itself is self-organizing. Because when I look at things like a star or galaxies, I mean, there are ways in which, as a physicist, you might say, oh, this process is self-organizing. Like magnetohydrodynamics, a field I've worked in a lot, which is how gases with magnetic fields work. There are qualities of self-organization we talk about, but not, like, I would not say that the universe is alive the way, life is alive. But I want to be careful there because, one of the things what we're trying to articulate, now this is very particular to our view. So we come very much from in the blind spot. We come from what's called the phenomenological tradition. So there's Edmund Husserl and the people who followed from them. This was a philosophy that emerged in the 1900s, or the turn of the last century, and was very influential in Europe. Not so much in England and the United States, and did not have much of an effect on the philosophy of science. But so we can go down the road if we want. But what I want to articulate is what's important about phenomenology is you got to start with experience, right? Phenomenology is really like that idea that you wanted to do. Oh, I want to talk about the universe by itself. They're kind of like, what do you mean by the universe by itself? Have you ever had an experience of the universe by itself? Have you ever had that third person God's eye view that sort of, comes from, that's sort of the kind of the naive realist view that you're told science gives you, right? Oh, let's talk about the universe 100 million years ago, right? Before there were any human beings. And so what we do is when we think about that, we think about like projecting ourselves to some point in deep space, looking out over the vast, grand, display of galaxies arrayed. But that's a story. Nobody's ever had that. Nobody ever has that experience. We are always, what phenomenology says is, look, you are always embedded already in experience, right? You have to be an experiencing agent in a community of experiencing agents, a community of language users, so that you can formulate these ideas into language, which itself is a community of living entities, enmeshed in ecosystems, before you can ever have even that story you want to tell yourself about a universe and galaxies. So that's why I would say you don't want to think about the universe as on its own being alive, because nobody gets an experience of the universe by itself. You are an experiencing agent. You're alive. You're part of a community of life. And the interesting thing for me about this is how agents, living systems, parse, or the word I really like is co-constitute both the world and the self. Those things never appear without each other. That is the sort of perspective that we are trying to find. What are the kind of scientific questions that you can go about scientifically answering Also the philosophical questions that you can go about philosophically answering. When you take that perspective, you don't try to separate world and self, or at least you try and understand how those two poles of self and world emerge out of this whole, which is the experiencing agent, right? And again, always remembering that experiencing agents are communities, right? As you said, that's what, Bateson's thing. There was Roshi Joan Halifax tells a great story about, she was hanging out with Bateson and I think it was Jonas Salk at the Lindisfarne Society. And Bateson said to Salk was very much a materialist, kind of doctor guy. And Bateson says, "Where's your mind?" And Salk points to his head up here. And Bateson says, no, out here. Right. And what he was saying is this idea of a distributed, embodied, that you can't talk about the mind without talking about everything else that supports there being a mind. And the fact that, we're using language to discuss this. Where did the language come? You didn't invent language, in your brain by itself. You have to have the whole history. Mind is in that sense, distributed or engaged. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think the proper way, in a way that's going to have scientific bite, is to not try and think about the universe being conscious by itself. We're conscious, we're experiencing, and the world comes into being in the form that it does because of us. It's this co-creation, co-constitution of environment and agent, self and world. That is maybe a more fruitful way of thinking about this.
I can't tell you why, but what you're saying intuitively makes sense. It's like and so just as an astrobiologist, as you're looking at these exoplanets and you're looking for life based on what you've shared around the phenomenology, and I'm Swiss, I'm also going to say it weird. How does that affect what you're looking for? If we're looking for, let's say, a gaseous life form, an oceanic life form, and you're looking for these patterns that show some co-constitutional aspects, let's say, how do you determine between, that's just a cloud being a cloud versus, that's life?
Right. So I would say, this is the interesting thing about this blind spot, trying to push beyond the blind spot. There's some cases where you don't need to push beyond the blind spot, right? If I'm looking at billiard balls on a table, right? I don't need to think about these deeper issues about, how the co-constitution, and this is the history of science was this, the first push in science had to be to push subjectivity away, right? We had to find a way of which aspects of my experience and your experience can we talk about together in a way that could be, mathematically described, could have, experimental validation. So, there's very important ways in which sometimes we have to push it. We don't need to take into account things like, the co-constitution. And it may be if I'm just looking for things that I call alive, I don't necessarily have to bring the phenomenology into it. I can sort of be a little bit more deeper into just sort of straight up science, right? Straight up sort of a kind of, mechanistic aspects of science, i.e., in the world that I'm in, as an experiencing subject, I see there's chemicals, there's chemistry, there's different elements, and the elements combine, and there are these beautiful rules. And so what I can do is I can look for the ways in which these agents would affect their environments, right? In ways that I don't have to care about. It looks like us, right? That it looks like, the most important one people are always like, oh, what if life is non-carbon based? Great question. What if life doesn't use water? What if water's not important? So say to your point of gas, how could I tell whether or not a cloud of gas is alive? Well, there's a lot of reasons why it's hard to imagine, a cloud of gas being alive, given what I think, even this most generous definition about self-organizing, et cetera, because I can see clouds and I can see gas clouds. I can see how they behave. I can see the velocity patterns in them. And I can ask, is there anything that's happening in the gas cloud that is involved with information exchange, right? Is there any way in which information is being held onto, is being processed, is being copied and, from one place to another? Because we believe that all these things, regardless of, the chemical substrate, the use of information to create meaning, that's going to be important. Like no matter what kind of life occurs in the universe, it's going to have to be moving information around and using information to make sense of itself and its world. So that's why, like with a gas cloud, we'd have to look for examples of that. Whereas, and that's why I think gas cloud, it could happen, but I don't think gas clouds are going to have the kind of structure, literally the structure that you need to be able to hold information, right? So one of the amazing things about the history of thinking about the physics of life was how Schrodinger, Mr. Quantum Mechanics, wrote this amazing book in 1947 where he called What is Life? And he was just, because he was so brilliant, he just was conjecturing, like, what would life need? And he sort of recognized that life was about information and that there needs to be some kind of molecule that has a structure, whose structure could be used to store information. So this was a few years before DNA was discovered. But he already saw that, like, the important point here is you have to have something that can hold information and move it around. Right. So that's what I mean. So like a gas cloud, I mean, we can see, there certainly, but we're going to be tend to look for things like that. We're going to be tending to look for ways that we can tell that there's a system there that is using information, and by using information is affecting its environment.
Ooh, question. And then I'll have to pull us away from this because there's another whole area of questions I would love to get into in our time. But you're using the word information. And what is information? Because DNA is information, but one can think that within an atom, I'm sure that it would, I don't know, it's electrical charge. Is that information? Like, where do you draw the boundary around what information is? Maybe it's too much of a rabbit hole, but
no, it's not. I mean, this is an interesting thing because I was thinking about this yesterday with my friends, with some colleagues, and I'm going to go talk to a guy. We have a visitor today who's works in thermodynamics, and these are the questions I'm going to ask him. Physics or science has a very formal definition of information. So information theory was born in 1947. Again, here we go back to that, with Claude Shannon. He wrote a very famous paper, which he was asking this kind of engineering question of like, look, I got a message. I want to send the message down down a line, right? And, there's some noise in the line, right? I'm trying to call him like, hey, Alexa, meet me at 3:00. But, there's wind blowing and everything. What's the theory? How can I sort of work out how much information is actually going to get to the receiver? So, I have a transmitter, a receiver, and a line with noise on it. So he developed this idea. This is where information theory was born. And it's super powerful. Like, what is a bit of information is associated with the probability that you've got an alphabet that's got, a bunch of characters in it, that the next, you're reading off a string of characters, the information is encoded or is related to the probability that the next character in the string you're getting is an E or something like that, right? Information is it's very mathematically, very beautifully defined in terms of surprise. What's the surprise, that you're going to get from the next letter as you're getting like one letter after another in a word, right? Because if I send you a string of zeros, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, for the, and the zeros go on for 5 hours, there's not a lot of information in that message, right? But as soon as a 1 pops up, you're gonna be like, whoa, something just changed, right? So that's a great definition. It's a very powerful definition. Every device you are using is based on Shannon information, which we can also call syntactic information. It's about syntax, right? I've got a grammar, the rules of a language, right? How do you put words together, et cetera. But there's what's amazing about that definition is that Shannon in the paper said, hey, you know what? I know information's really about meaning, but he says, I can't deal with that. Like, all I want to do is build a receiver and transmit. I want to work this out. I am purposely pushing meaning out of my definition, right? So syntactic information really has nothing to do with meaning. And when it comes to life, meaning intuitively, right? Intuitively, we think that meaning is important. So what you really need is a theory of semantic information. And this is something I and my colleagues have been working on for the last few years. There was a beautiful paper in 2018 by Artemy Kolchinsky and David Wolpert, which sort of laid out the beginnings of a mathematical theory of semantic information, which is built off of Shannon information, but tries to take into account that, like, for you and I, and again, this intuitive idea that information is about knowing something. And of course, if that's true, then there's a knower. There's someone there knowing, right? And so the Shannon information is kind of abstracted. It sort of, again, treats information like it's something floating out there in this third person God's eye view. And a semantic information say, like, no, information is always about somebody knowing something ultimately. So there are rigorous definitions for information. And so, like, an electron by itself doesn't have information. You have to measure it. You have to do something to it to extract, or it's about its interaction with something else where there is information passed, held, copied, processed. But we need to take into account, especially with life, we need to take into account that information always has a semantic quality. And can we develop a rigorous mathematical, way of having meaning, of bringing meaning back?
All right. I am so want to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm going to pause.
It's interesting. That part is really interesting.
No, I mean, it's honestly, it's absolutely thrilling. And I'm going to look up that paper. I'll stop my curiosity brain for a moment. So if we talk about humans becoming interplanetary, which is one of the provocative, if not heretical things that you've spoken about, and you've said, right, that if we make it through what the climate crisis and all of the things that are upon us and things like rampant AI and, the next thousands of years will potentially be about humans becoming interplanetary and populating the solar system. And you've said also that for us to do that, we currently, and I've queued this up in the intro, but we have a technosphere, a technological system or exosphere around the planet that is quite immature. And right now it is not life generating, it is extractive and leading us to a path of, different forms of extinction or at least breakdown. And you said that we need a new vision of nature for us to mature that technosphere and potentially become interplanetary. And so I'd love to understand, when you say that we need a new vision of nature to sort of mature ourselves, and when you speak about the potential of this interplanetary vision to actually be something that is rousing in a positive way for us, rather than like, peace out planet B, peace out planet A and go to planet B, which is not at all the sense I get from your work. Speak to me about this interplanetary aspect, both in the maturity component and then the what it does for us component at this moment in time.
Okay. So the planet B thing is stupid. That's Elon Musk's like ridiculous. We're going to build a civilization on Mars someday, but no time soon. And, if Earth goes, everything goes, right? So the idea that there's a planet B is just like some kind of bad science fiction. The thing that always amazes me about these tech bros, it's like, they've read all the same science fiction I have. Like we all were raised on, Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Blue Mars series, but they got the wrong lessons out of them. I'm always amazed. Like, dude, like with cyberpunk, they don't understand. They've read all the cyberpunk stories, but they don't recognize they're the villain. It's like, you're not the cool, programmer dude. You're the villain in that. Anyway, so
maybe they're happy to be the villain.
Well, that may be. Yeah, sometimes I think that's sort of what we're finding out. Yeah, but okay. So this idea of the human future, right? So unless we deal with climate change, unless we get through climate change, I doubt we're going to be in a situation in 200 years to be, trying to, settle the solar system. Because, really this is something I always want to say. The question that's before us is not to save the Earth. That is a massive misunderstanding of what's going on. The Earth, the biosphere, which is the sum total of life on the planet, has been around for 3.5 billion years. It has faced worse things than us, including giant comet impacts that wiped out all the dinosaurs, right? So as the comedian George Carlin once said, if we screw around, the Earth will shake us off like fleas on a dog. So the question is not to save the Earth, because the Earth is not the biosphere is not a furry little bunny, right? That we need to protect. Instead, we need to be afraid of the Earth, right? We need to recognize that the Earth is, this gets us to Gaia, is a kind of God, right? In the sense that it literally channels cosmic power, which is solar energy, the amount of solar energy that is falling on the Earth that flows through the coupled Earth systems, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the cryosphere, all the ice, the hydrosphere. These is what we call the coupled Earth systems, is ginormous. It's impossible to recognize how much energy is flowing through that. And right now it's kind of balanced, so to speak, in the sense that we have the Holocene. That's the geological era we're living in now, which is ending because of us. And that if you untip that balance, look out. So the goal is to save us, is to save this kind of, some version of this kind of civilization where human beings can thrive. But they have to thrive with the biosphere, right? So this is the idea of a mature technosphere. So this is a paper that I wrote with Sarah Walker and David Grinspoon a few years back, where we were investigating the idea of planetary intelligence. And what we meant by that was the biosphere has been around for a long time. The biosphere lives on top of the geospheres. The biosphere gets energy from the sunlight and the soil, and, or at least it works with the air, the water, the ice. So the biosphere sits on top of what we call the geospheres. And our civilization, which we call the technosphere, all of the technology and all of its powerful impact lives on top of the biosphere. Now, a long time ago, the biosphere went from an immature state where it wasn't really self-regulating. It wasn't really, it would have died if there was another massive comet impact. It probably did. There may have been a few cycles of that. But eventually the biosphere became powerful enough to exert really strong influences on the geosphere. And to some degree, whether it's fully self-regulating or not, to some degree really started to become a planetary force. A planetary force that could hang on and survive over billions of years. The technosphere that we have just built is immature because it's literally destroying the substrate on which it depends, right? It is the way it affects the biosphere. It's changing the biosphere in a way that is going to be detrimental to the technosphere's own health. So what we need to do is develop a mature technosphere that works with, that lives with, that is integrated with the biosphere and the rest of the planet. So that's what we mean by a mature technosphere. That's our goal. That's what it means. That's what a sustainable, long-term technological civilization means. So how does this relate to going interplanetary? So if we do that, then we're going to have a civilization on Earth, a human civilization, for 100, 500, 1,000, 10,000 years. And what are we going to do during all that time, right? That's a lot of time, right? So, of course, we're going to push into space, right? I mean, we're already doing it. It's kind of what we do, right? And so we will, look to settle every nook and cranny in the solar system. And we may terraform Mars. That would take a long time. That would be thousands of years. But we also, we will figure out how to build settlements, human settlements. One thing that we did some papers on was the idea of taking asteroids and hollowing them out and spinning them up so you could live on the inside. You'd have gravity, So the idea of interplanetary habitats where you could have as much surface area as Manhattan. A lot of people living in Manhattan. So imagine hundreds of thousands of those, in the solar system. The moons of Jupiter are places maybe you could have human settlements. So why is this important, right? Well, first of all, I think it's going to happen because, again, our whole history has been like, what's over that next hill? Like, that is just what we do. And often we do it because we're like, I hate these guys. These guys are driving me crazy. I don't want to hang out with them anymore. I want my own place. And there's a word for this. It's called schismogenesis. I love that name. Oh, and it's basically, it's like, I hate these guys. They're all wearing blue shoes. I hate blue shoes. I like red shoes. I want to form a town where people only wear red shoes. And the beauty of this actually is the idea that every one of those space settlements with 1 million people in it will be an experiment in humanity, right? I am sure there are going to be Mormon space habitats because the Mormons are going to be like, we want our own thing. You could have space habitats that were radical democracies where everybody votes on everything all the time. There are going to be experiments in human flourishing. And some you probably don't want to go to, and some you may want to go to. But what it means is that it means two things. First of all, it will give human beings this possibility to experiment, as they always have been. So an aside, so let's put a pin on that. One of the worst things about the moment we live in right now is something that I've heard termed capitalist realism, which is somehow we've narrowed it down to think like the only political arrangement that's possible is this particular form of market capitalism, right? There's lots of other kinds of capitalism, right? There's regenerative capitalism. There's all kinds of other ways of organizing ourselves politically that somehow we've been told none of those work or are possible, except for this kind where like Elon Musk sits on top of and that is a real that we've been purposely sort of narrowed down in our political imaginations. So that's one of the reasons I think this would be important, is to have the flourishing of our political imaginations. The other point, though, if we were to go build a settlement on Mars, and then eventually after 100, 200, 500 years, there's 1 billion people living on Mars, that's not human beings reaching out to Mars. That's the biosphere, right? We are the agents of Earth's biosphere reaching out to Mars, because what one thing life wants is more life, right? And so we should understand that like we are just the latest thing the biosphere is doing. And the settlement of the solar system is just part of the expansion of life, of the expansion of the biosphere. So, for both of those reasons, I think this is important. Now, eventually, could we go interstellar? Could we actually go, travel among the stars? I'm a little skeptical of that because of the physics that's involved. But of course, maybe we will find a way. Maybe there is warp drives or things like that, in which case then life will really find a way to, sort of build galactic communities. But certainly interplanetary communities is absolutely possible within the laws of physics we have now.
I really also think, based on what you're saying, that, we need like these multi-generational projects that evoke such big visions, like the Manhattan Project. It's what's so missing right now because people are scattered in all their dimensions. And so there's something about the space dream. And that actually brings me to probably just one of the final questions for the day, which is, I love this word schismogenesis. You've introduced me to a lot of cool new words. And the other one that I hadn't come across before I read your book, Constant Fire, and I might not say it right because it's the first time I'm going to say it out loud, but a hierophany or hierophany. And I looked up the word and you also defined it, but you're saying hierophanies are gateways to the experience of the world as sacred, and that science, just like myths, can be an animating force towards our experience of the world as sacred. And obviously, if we've looked a little bit at, the trajectory of human history, we have always had that impulse towards it. We built Göbekli Tepe, right? We built temples maybe before we were, who knows? And the cave, caves and all of that, cave paintings and worship and prayer and shamanism. And so maybe just to close up, if science is the sort of gateway to the sacred, what does cosmology in the field that you're working in and that you're describing, how does that sort of support us as a myth or narrative during this time? And you alluded to a bit with the interstellar or let's say interplanetary piece, but it would be interesting to go just a little bit deeper on that.
Well, I think, so in that was my first book, The Constant Fire, where I was just beginning to probe the ideas of science and human spiritual endeavor, right? We all know, there's a way in which science and religion or science and spirituality are cast as being enemies. And I don't think that's true. But, we also have to be careful. I'm not a big fan of the New Age stuff, because the New Age stuff often is just like, it's kind of like pseudoscience. It's, it'll just throw around anything you want. And that's like, science supports this. It's like, it doesn't. But so I've been a practicing Buddhist for 30 years. And so, I think within it's important to sort of connect to the lineage, to, the lineage of human beings trying to do this, to connect to the sacred. And that's a word I landed on. I really thought a lot about which word I was going to use because, there's so much contention over this, but sacredness is a word I like because people have that. It's a very basic experience of, you come to a glade in a forest when you're hiking and it's for a moment, there's that expansive feeling, what Freud called the oceanic feeling, the feeling of awe, which Rudolf Otto, one of the great, theorizers of religion, identified as being, the fundamental religious experience or the fundamental spiritual experience was of awe. So sacredness is this sort of fundamental human experience. And I think it's what leads us into so much of our creative endeavors in the arts, in the sciences, and then also, depending on who you are, that may drive you into a life of contemplative practice or a life of spiritual practice. And so, I think the reason why I identified science as being one gateway, just like, you go to the art museum, right? You go to the art museum and you're like, why do you go to the art museum? Because you're going to walk around and look at all these paintings, and you're kind of hoping that a couple of them are really going to kick you in the head. Right? You're looking to have an experience of sacredness, of awe, of being transported. What I was trying to identify was that science has that role. And that, cosmology, of course, because anytime we think about the universe, drives us to that expansion. But I feel like, we should be, a leaf. Like if you just learn about photosynthesis, which I've had to do, I didn't really know anything about the details of photosynthesis. But when I switched from being a theoretical astrophysicist, looking at how stars form, to starting to do astrobiology, I had to really learn more about the details of life. And I remember learning about photosynthesis, and I can't look at leaves the same anymore. Every time if I can get into that headspace and I walk around looking at green things, I'm transported as if I was, listening to my favorite Zeppelin album, or, being at an art gallery and looking at a Jackson Pollock, So, I think what science can be, whether we're thinking about the universe and space as a whole, or these big questions about life and other planets, or just the dust motes, responding to electromagnetic fields as they pass through the lamp that I'm looking at. Science can be a gateway for us. The most important thing is to be pulled out of your senselessness, right? We go through most of our lives, we're not paying attention. We're just not paying attention. We're worrying about, that guy doesn't like me, or, I've got these problems. My car, the tire's flat, and of course, obviously life has lots of suffering in it. But, there's this way in which if we can pay attention, then our stories, our individual stories, can be embedded in this much broader, much more grounded and expansive story of the rest of the universe, of which we are, members, of which we are part of the story. And it's just, I think it's, it's personally, it's fulfilling, or more than fulfilling. Personally, it's salvetic, right? There's a kind of saving in it. And then also it's just crucial for us to be able to be compassionate, which is, one of the most amazing things I learned with Buddhism was, I came in for enlightenment, right? And I just wanted to know the fundamental nature of reality. And I left with compassion, because you can't have sort of that deeper knowledge of how everything is connected on this level, that's sort of below language, without having that rudimentary compassion for everything else like you that is alive.
I actually like what you're saying around how when you a thing truly deeply seen and understood can only have you kind of fall in love with it. It makes me think, David White speaks of he has this line that says poetry is the thing against which we have no defenses. And I think that the knowledge and all the things you've been referring to, like the intricacies of a leaf, like it can just bring that awe and that like dropping of defenses at the beauty of the world. I would want to keep talking for so much longer. I have a ton of things I didn't get to, but Adam, you are working in such a fascinating space. I'm going to be following you for decades and all the things you're uncovering. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Great, Alexa. I really enjoyed this. Was we went to some cool places, and it's always nice to have a conversation like this where you can kind of do a deeper dive. And I learned things from having these kind of conversations myself. So thank you.
So there you have it. More questions than answers, and a conversation I think you'll find hopefully somewhat as expansive as the cosmos that it explores. As Adam wrote in his first book, The Constant Fire, science and spiritual endeavor both emerge from the same elemental experience of the world's sacred character. Science emanates from our mythic call to create meaning. Which brings me back to where we started. Humanity has always looked up, from the Paleolithic man to the astrobiologist scanning alien atmospheres for the signature of something alive. We have never stopped asking what is out there and what is in there. Now we can see ourselves as the agents of Earth's biosphere reaching out to Mars. And I wonder, I think that the mystery is also maybe the whole point of it. A cosmos that has yielded all of its secret to us, it would be a very different cosmos. I'll leave it there for today. Thank you as ever for listening, and looking forward to seeing you in some weeks' time.